In the span of a single recent year, America absorbed a heat dome that shattered Pacific Northwest temperature records, a hurricane that dropped catastrophic flooding on a mountain city hundreds of miles from any coastline, wildfire seasons stretching longer than historical averages allowed, and drought conditions pushing the nation's largest reservoirs toward critical thresholds. None of these were isolated events. Meteorologists, studying them together, have started describing something more troubling than any single storm: a pattern. That distinction matters enormously, and it's the reason this story isn't about one disaster. It's about what happens when multiple, seemingly unconnected, extreme weather trends start reinforcing each other across an entire country at the same time. Let's be precise before we go further, because that precision is exactly what separates useful analysis from fear-driven exaggeration. This isn't a claim that America's weather has become uniformly catastrophic overnight. What we're going to walk through is the actual pattern researchers have identified, connecting these seemingly separate disasters, the atmospheric mechanism tying them together, and why the pattern itself, not any single event, is what's drawing sustained scientific concern. Start with the concept meteorologists increasingly use to describe what's happening: atmospheric blocking. Under normal conditions, the jet stream, a fast-moving river of high-altitude air circling the globe, keeps weather systems moving relatively quickly across the country, preventing any single pattern, whether extreme heat, drought, or heavy rain, from settling over one region for too long. Now understand what happens when that flow breaks down. A blocking pattern occurs when a large area of high or low pressure becomes essentially stuck in place, forcing the jet stream to bend dramatically around it rather than pushing through. Instead of weather systems cycling through a region over a day or two, the same conditions can lock in place for days, sometimes weeks, allowing whatever is happening, extreme heat, drought, or persistent storminess, to intensify far beyond what a normally moving system would produce. That's the mechanism behind the 2021 Pacific Northwest heat dome, the mechanism behind extended drought conditions gripping the American Southwest, and increasingly, the mechanism researchers point to when explaining why individual disasters across the country have grown more intense and more prolonged than historical patterns would predict. Each of these individual events made national headlines in its own right, treated by most coverage as a standalone story with its own standalone cause. The pattern researchers are now emphasizing pushes back directly against that framing, arguing that the shared atmospheric mechanism deserves at least as much attention as any single event's specific, immediate details. Read that again slowly. Not four separate, unrelated weather stories. Four expressions of the same underlying atmospheric behavior are showing up in different regions, at different times, producing different surface effects. That reframing matters enormously for how the country as a whole should think about preparedness. Treating a wildfire crisis in California, a hurricane in Louisiana, and a drought gripping the Colorado River Basin as three unconnected news stories misses the underlying thread linking them, and misses it at exactly the moment when understanding that connection could meaningfully improve how resources and attention get allocated across the country. Here's where the pattern becomes genuinely concerning. Climate researchers have connected the increasing frequency of these blocking events to a specific, measurable change happening in the Arctic. The Arctic has been warming significantly faster than the rest of the planet in recent decades, a phenomenon scientists call Arctic amplification, and that accelerated warming has narrowed the temperature difference between the Arctic and the mid-latitudes, where most of the country's population lives. Arctic amplification itself stems from a well-understood physical feedback loop. As sea ice melts, it exposes darker ocean water that absorbs far more solar energy than the reflective ice it replaced, accelerating local warming even further. That self-reinforcing cycle is part of why the Arctic has warmed at a rate several times faster than the global average in recent decades, a pace fast enough to measurably reshape the temperature contrast driving weather patterns thousands of miles to the south. That narrowing temperature contrast matters because it's the primary force that historically kept the jet stream moving in a relatively fast, straight path. A sharper temperature difference produces a stronger, faster jet stream, one that moves weather through efficiently rather than letting it stall. As that contrast weakens, a growing body of research suggests the jet stream becomes more prone to exactly the kind of wavy, stalled patterns responsible for blocking events. Some researchers have compared the jet stream's behavior under this weakened contrast to a river losing some of its downhill slope. A steep river moves fast and relatively straight. A river on flatter ground meanders, forming loops and bends that persist far longer than the water's overall downstream flow would suggest. That's roughly the shift some atmospheric scientists describe happening to the jet stream itself, producing exactly the kind of large, slow-moving loops that create blocking patterns capable of locking weather in place for extended stretches. But that's not even the most disturbing part of this broader pattern. These individual blocking-driven disasters don't just happen in isolation. They compound each other in ways that make the overall national picture considerably more dangerous than any single event would suggest. Consider how drought and wildfire risk reinforce each other directly. Extended blocking patterns that produce drought also dry out vegetation across enormous stretches of the American West, creating exactly the fuel conditions that allow wildfires to spread further and burn hotter than they would in a normal precipitation year. Those same burned landscapes then become dramatically more vulnerable to catastrophic flooding and debris flows the moment a storm system, itself possibly intensified by a separate blocking pattern, finally delivers rain. Wildfire smoke itself adds another layer to this compounding cycle that's easy to overlook. Smoke particles injected high into the atmosphere during severe fire seasons can influence local weather patterns in the days and weeks that follow, and public health systems already strained by extreme heat then face the added burden of hazardous air quality across enormous population centers, sometimes thousands of miles from the fires actually producing it. Now let's be exactly as careful as the researchers studying this pattern are, because that precision protects you from both panic and complacency. Scientists cannot say with certainty that any specific future disaster will result directly from this pattern. And year-to-year weather still carries genuine natural variability that no single mechanism fully explains. What researchers can say with much greater confidence is that the underlying conditions favoring blocking events, particularly the narrowing Arctic temperature contrast, show a clear, measurable trend. And that trend is expected to continue as long as the broader warming pattern driving it persists. That's a meaningfully different claim than predicting specific disasters, and it's exactly the kind of calibrated language credible climate research requires. Researchers studying this trend are also careful to note that not every extreme weather event traces back to atmospheric blocking specifically, and other factors, from regional geography to unrelated short-term weather variability, continue to play a meaningful role in any individual disaster's development. That distinction between an uncertain specific forecast and a clear underlying trend is precisely why emergency management officials and climate researchers increasingly argue that disaster planning needs to account for compounding, overlapping risks, rather than treating each hazard as a separate independent planning exercise. So what does this actually mean for the country as a whole? It means the old model of disaster planning, treating wildfire season, hurricane season, and drought as largely separate sequential concerns, is becoming less reliable with each passing year, replaced by a reality where these hazards increasingly overlap in timing and reinforce each other in severity. So what can you actually do with this information, regardless of which specific region you call home? Start by understanding your own region's full range of weather related risks, not just the single hazard you've historically worried about most, since blocking-driven patterns have repeatedly demonstrated the ability to push regions into unfamiliar territory. From unprecedented heat in traditionally mild climates to catastrophic flooding in areas that had never experienced it at that scale. Build a genuinely robust emergency preparedness plan capable of sustaining your household for at least a week without significant outside assistance, since overlapping national disasters can measurably slow response times even in regions with strong local emergency infrastructure. That kind of preparation should extend beyond simply stockpiling supplies. Know your region's specific evacuation routes for whichever hazards apply most directly, whether wildfire, flooding, or hurricanes, and revisit that plan periodically, rather than assuming conditions from a decade ago still accurately describe your area's current risk profile. Pay attention to how meteorologists communicate about blocking patterns. Specifically in seasonal forecasts, since language indicating a persistent ridge or stalled system is a meaningful signal that whatever conditions are developing, heat, drought, or heavy rain, are likely to intensify beyond what a normally moving weather system would produce. And here's the step people consistently underestimate. Support infrastructure. Investment in updated building codes in your own community that account for this compounding risk pattern, rather than historical averages alone. Since the gap between old infrastructure assumptions and the reality of blocking-driven extreme weather is precisely what has turned recent individual disasters into some of the most costly and deadly events in recent American history. Infrastructure planning has historically relied heavily on backward-looking statistics, designing stormwater systems, building codes, and water management strategy around decades of past weather data. A pattern that's actively shifting, rather than remaining statistically stable, undermines that entire planning approach, which is exactly why more communities are beginning to incorporate forward-looking climate projections rather than purely historical averages into their infrastructure decisions. Before you go, let us know in the comments which part of this pattern concerns you most, the heat, the drought, the flooding, or the way they compound each other, because each piece connects back to the same underlying atmospheric shift. And if you want to keep tracking how this pattern develops across the country, stay subscribed, because we'll be following it closely as new data comes in, region by region. Let's close where we started, a heat dome, a hurricane's floodwaters reaching a city that never expected them, wildfire seasons stretching longer than history predicted, reservoirs dropping toward thresholds nobody wanted to test, 4 disasters that looked separate on the surface, one atmospheric pattern connecting all of them underneath. And it isn't finished rewriting the rules. That's the real story worth carrying forward, long after any single one of these events fades from the headlines. Understanding the connection between them doesn't just satisfy curiosity. It's exactly the kind of insight that should be shaping how communities, infrastructure, and emergency systems prepare for a version of American weather that no longer plays by the calendar most planning was originally built around,